it says live there, but not there. So
It says there's 9 people and we got 3 thumbs up. So let's see how that
okay,
goes.
let's go.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first ever live edition of a Paratrooper and a Yogi walk into a bar. And I'm delighted that I'm joined with my regular podcast partner, Shana Meyerson, who is the host of the Yoga of War podcast that you can find on YouTube.
Yeah, and I'm having like total COVID deja vu here. Here we are at a virtual bar this week, and I have an empty glass that would have been water, but for the fact that I learned the very hard way not to put liquids near my tech. So, you got the full beer stein of water. We're clean and sober all the time, at least in Los Angeles, in my condo. Andrew Fox, the Mullah Monitor himself, also known as Mr. Andrew Fox on Substack and Axe. Enlighten us. There's so much going on.
Yeah, so we're talking about Iran clearly, and it's been a fascinating 3 days. It started on Friday here in the UK. I think it might have been Thursday where you are, but I'll call it Friday, Saturday, Sunday, just for simplicity's sake. So I think we all knew Bibi's lifelong ambition was to take down the regime in Iran, and Mr. Trump's election has given him that opportunity. And I think it's probably safe to say he's been planning this, Bibi, since the American election was decided. I don't think this would ever have happened under Biden. Not that I don't think Biden was a Zionist, because I think he was. I think he was a supporter of Israel, but he had such political constraints on the left in America that he was heavily curtailed on what he wanted to achieve when it came to the Israel war, especially with that election coming up where it was such a polarized and charged electoral issue in the US. And Israel's been preparing for this for years and years and years. Even before 7th of October, this was something that Israel had been looking at and planning at. Mossad have spent decades infesting Iran with a complete takedown of their internal security. There was a huge boon for Mossad, of course, when the Iranian regime kicked out all of their Jews, many of whom went to Israel. But what that's done is it's given Mossad a ready-made cadre of Farsi speakers who look, feel, and sound Iranian, which is a huge, it's a huge bonus when you're trying to infiltrate a foreign country with a foreign language and a foreign culture. So that's been a result. Of course, everything started with that incredible drone attack, which really is taking taking another field of warfare forward. It's building on what the Ukrainians did in Russia, where they had those shipping containers full of drones that they smuggled into the country and took out a bunch of Russia's strategic bombers. What was incredible about this Israeli operation was that it sounds like the drones were actually built and made inside Iran itself over a long period of time. So a hell of a job by Mossad. And we've seen Mossad running around the streets of Tehran, randomly assassinating people as well. They're having one of their best weeks ever, frankly.
Right now, I think that the Ayatollah's bodyguards need bodyguards. I don't think that he knows there's got to be people literally right next to him who are Mossad. He cannot trust anyone right now.
Yeah, and we'll talk about what's going to happen to Khamenei in a bit. I think it's a critical juncture in this war, is that man's fate. But we'll come on to that. We saw the Israeli waves of airstrikes that just started degrading military infrastructure, degrading rockets that were pointing at Israel, degrading the IRGC, killing scores of top commanders and generals. And I think this all points towards a much bigger strategic goal than just the one stated on Friday, which was to take down Iran's nuclear regime. That was obviously a stated goal. The big issue, of course, is that Israel actually doesn't have the capability. It doesn't have that kind of integral capability to do that. It can bring in things from outside, but that Fordo nuclear plant is the biggie. So there was 2 big centrifuge sites, Natanz and Fordo. Natanz, they had over the last few years massively scaled back the production there, and Fordo became the center of that centrifuge refinement of uranium piece. Fordo is half a mile deep under a mountain. It's a huge complex, incredibly difficult to access. And one striking feature of the way Iran has set up its defenses is that they've kind of done a variation of Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon in some ways, because they know they can't really stop stuff on the surface being struck, so they've gone underground. And I think if we're looking for trends that emerge in warfare going forward and into the future, and when we're trying to look at our own armies and the sort of things that we might have to fight, I think underground warfare is going to have to be a centerpiece of military planning in the future.
But let me ask you a question, Andrew. Since there are no hostages, for example, and you can't get underground without starting above ground, can Israel, like, I'm imagining when I'm walking down the street and there, like when I was a kid, I don't do this anymore, and there was like an ant hill, and you're like, oh, we could just flatten this out, and the ants won't be able to come out anymore. Like, can Israel, with all their intelligence, close off the entryways and basically seal it off because there's no hostages underground to worry about killing?
I mean, yeah, but it's not an enduring solution, because after the war, the other side can then just go dig it out and start again. And if you look at the tunnels, even the tunnels that I went to in Lebanon, I went into Lebanon with the IDF, went down into a captured Hezbollah tunnel. They've got air circulation systems. They're pretty self-sufficient. Huge food supplies, water supplies, fire suppression systems, and that was just your absolutely basic
Okay.
Hezbollah tunnel. Whereas a site like Fordo is going to have a huge amount of life support, so you could seal them in, the war ends, and they just dig them out and carry on. So it's
Right.
not ideal. And of course, knowing where all the entrances are is really tricky too. They will have secret tunnels in and out and all that shenanigans. So it's not. I don't think it's a decisive conclusion to do that. But
Is it hackable? I
no,
mean,
because
theoretically.
they've reacted to Stuxnet, and they've started doing completely air-walled systems in these bases.
Okay, so
So
no.
so yeah, Israel's done it before, and so
Yeah.
all warfare is adaptation. Side A does something, side B does something in reaction, and so on and so forth. And so the reaction to Stuxnet was to airwall their computer systems at these places. Now that doesn't mean someone can't sneak in and put a virus into the system or some other kind of random Mossad lunacy that nobody ever saw coming. That's a possibility, of course, but we'd be wildly speculating if we tried to predict that one. And I don't think that's where we want to be in terms of the analytical space. We're trying to stick to what we know. So yeah, Israel has set off on this mission to stop the nuclear sites, and they don't have the capability to do that unless they bang in a commando raid like they did in Syria, which is possible. But I've done night raids with special forces in Afghanistan. I've done a bit of planning on this stuff, and I've done a bit of participation, and it's not a raid that I would want to have a crack at. There's a very, very high risk of everyone dying.
Oh my
And
God.
why take that risk when you don't need to?
Would it
You
be
know,
like a kamikaze operation? I mean, you're saying everyone would
no,
die,
no,
but
no,
would they
no. You
win?
do a
Would they
you
have
do.
success?
No, you do a proper infill. You'd infiltrate. You would carry out the mission. You would destroy what you had to destroy, and then you would try and exfiltrate.
Right.
But that is very, very high risk in this situation, especially on a
Right.
site like Fordo, where it's really hard to actually, do a full reconnaissance of the site. You'd be going in on schematics that you've probably taken an estimate at. Um, you may have had a spy in there to map it out properly, but the odds of one spy getting a complete map of the entire complex is pretty low. So it's there's so many factors here that just make it, I think, unnecessarily risky. Why would you risk your best commandos' lives on a mission that actually I don't think you need to do, because there's other ways that Israel can approach this. And I think the other way they've set upon is regime change. That would be my best bet. So you get rid of Iran's nuclear capability by, if you can't change, if the regime are trying to get nuclear weapons and you can't get rid of the nuclear weapons, you get rid of the regime. Um, Obviously, that's easier said than done as well, because you can cause a collapse. But I wrote on Substack the other day, there are three factors that you need, and that we see historically as trends when regime change comes along. The first one is military factors. And I'm not talking about a decisive military defeat, because
Mhm.
frankly, we're there already. We were there 2 days ago. The Iranians are getting absolutely hammered. This is the most one-sided ass kicking imaginable. And don't buy the international media narrative showing all those buildings on fire in Israel and injured and dead Israelis on stretchers. It's a distraction. Look, hardly anything has got through. Yes, some damage has been done. Yes, of course, people have been hurt, and that is deeply tragic. But if we're tallying each side's achievements, Israel is so far in the lead that they're untouchable at this point. It is absolutely not a tit for tat war. It's a one-sided beating. So militarily, Iran is defeated. But when we talk about military factors in regime change, what we're talking about is something seismic, like the Iranian army laying down their arms and refusing to fight for the regime anymore. Maybe even the battalions or regiments changing sides and fighting for a social upheaval. Which leads me to the second factor, which is that social upheaval perspective. And that's where the people rise up and try and take control of the regime. We're not there yet. We're not. It's as simple as that. The factor in Iran is really tricky because there's no one opposition. There's no one consolidated figure that everyone can get behind. People are trying to push Pahlavi, the son of the Shah, but he's still hugely unpopular with rafts of people in Iran because they remember how awful his father was. You know, this is not a good guy, the Shah. Seriously repressive stuff. So there's no cohesion on that opposition, and to generate that groundswell, I think is going to be really tricky.
Do you
Um,
think that if the US like stepped in and took out Ferdowd because it would take like the US 1 second to do it, that would be what would embolden the people enough to say, hey, maybe the US is on our side and here's our chance?
yeah, I think it potentially would. I mean, it would be hugely out of character for the US to turn up to a war late, wouldn't it? um, the
Well, not, but yes and no, though. I feel like, I mean, I don't feel like this. It's true. Israel is doing everyone's dirty work, and like the biggest countries on earth are like hiding behind little tiny Israel and going, you go, you go.
Well, the biggest country of work in the world is, and many other countries are saying, "Stop it, Israel! Don't do it." Go for, the UK line is go for de-escalation and diplomacy, thanks to the intellectual titans that we have running the UK right now. Um, yeah, but the point is, if the Americans came in, you could take care of Fordo, and then it's win-win because even if the regime doesn't fall, you've still taken out the nuclear capability. If you get the regime change off the back of that as a second order effect, then that's an even better result. But if Israel's gone in with the stated aim of taking out the nukes, then if America joins in, then that happens, which is great. Um, and the third factor, so we've looked at the military factor, we've looked at the social factor, and the final one is the psychological shock factor, which normally, if you think back to Syria when that collapsed, when Assad fled the country for Russia, that was the psychological shock moment. And you'll remember, I'm sure, that things happened really fast once that had occurred. So once that psychological tipping point goes, when people realize the regime isn't in control anymore, these things snowball and avalanche downhill very, very quickly. So there are three factors you need for regime change, and we're not seeing all three yet, but we're getting there. I think there's slow reports of some of those things starting to happen, and it's a situation we just have to monitor. Of course, another option might be that the supreme leader and the president are killed. There's pretty good reporting that Khamenei is holed up in a bunker in the northeast of Tehran. If America comes into to play, then those massive ordnance penetrators, the 30,000-pounder super bunker busters, come into play, and then all bets are off, quite frankly. So we'll
And
just have to wait and see.
the other thing is that his son, who's further hardline, who happens to be his intended successor, is in the same bunker as he is. Like, I'm thinking about, like, I hate this, but since 9/11, families, at least in America, when they fly, like, just fly, like, to New York, they put the parents on different planes just in case. Like,
Do they?
don't go in the bunker with your son who you hope to succeed you, because if anything happens to you, they're both gone.
Yeah, and we saw that with the Air Force general staff. They all got wiped out in one hit because they were all in the same bunker. So yeah, there's loads of options on the table here, and we don't know how it's going to go. But what we do know is that this is a massive Israeli win. Like, the war's won, and all we have to work through now is the end game, what that actually looked like. And that will depend on a number of factors. Is America involved? Does Iran show any willingness to negotiate and hand over its nuclear facilities voluntarily? Um, what happens to the leadership is a big deal as well. And then what happens with the people on the ground in Iran? Do they rise up, or do they kind of still feel sufficiently intimidated that they don't dare? So yeah, there's loads of different factors this way and that way that we can't predict the outcome with any certainty, but we do know that the 6-day war for rapid victory, the record is gone, and the 3-day war is a very clear Israeli win.
But okay, so Andrea, I have a few questions. Like one
Mm.
is, how come last year in like April and or was it April and October, Iran sent 300 plus missiles at once and had no destruction. But now they're sending 100 at once and having much more success. Are they different missiles? Like, why are they having so much more success now when they were sending 3 times as much at a time last time
The
and the time
straightforward,
before?
the straightforward answer is that they're not stupid and they've learned. So they will have looked at Israel's defenses. They'll have very carefully assessed why their missiles weren't penetrating Israel's missile defense systems, and they will have adjusted their targeting or the way they sequence rockets, or a variety of different things, to then work out how they do that. And look, you've got to remember, some of these hits aren't direct missile strikes. Some of them are fragments that are coming
Yeah.
down because the missile's been shot down. A number of missiles also have been let through because Israel can plot the trajectory of the missile, work out where it's likely to land, and if it's in the middle of the Negev, then who cares? Maybe some ibex will get killed, but that's pretty much it.
Oh.
And we don't want any. We don't. We don't want any ibex being killed. But also, do we want to? Do we want to waste? Do we want to waste an Arrow 3 missile costing a
Right.
fortune on a chunk of empty desert? So there's some stat padding going on, um, by the fact that Israel is allowing some missiles through. And the actual direct physical missile that has penetrated and actually caused a full-size detonation of that missile is minuscule. It's in the handfuls.
Yeah. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind, because we're talking a lot about, and everybody's talking a lot about because it's the thing, is the nuclear. But honestly, this isn't just about nuclear. So Iran has been working on, their goal is 3,000 ICBMs a year, which means like in just 3 years, they'd have 10,000. Tiny little Israel would have no defenses. It sounds like right now, as of a few hours ago, Israel has taken out approximately 1/3 of the launchers. I have another like numbers question. Israel decapitated Hezbollah, which had 180,000 missiles. Of course, Lebanon is this small, and Iran is quite huge. But from what I understand, the launchers in Iran are also much larger, much more conspicuous. Israel intelligence seems to know where everything is. Why is it so much harder to take out 2,000 missiles from Iran than 180,000 from Hezbollah?
Well, they didn't take out 180,000 from Hezbollah. I think that's probably the first point. They pulverized Hezbollah until they stopped firing. Is the bottom line there? I mean, those missiles are still floating around,
Oh,
significant numbers in Lebanon, but Hezbollah don't dare fire them. And that's a problem for, I think, further down the line. Those Iranian missile sites, they are pretty heavily defended. They're not just driving around the open waiting to be a target. If you go afterwards and have a look at some of the missile cities, they call them, in Iran, they're quite impressive. And again, very similar to Fordo, they're dug into the mountains, very well protected. But the fact that so many, what's the word I'm after? So fewer missiles are being fired right now is
yeah.
indicative, I think, of the attrition that Israel has inflicted on their launches. Now, I've seen people who are having a high degree of cope, saying, Iran's just keeping its powder dry. But that doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you keep your powder dry when your country is being taken apart around you at will by Israel?
And they're
It just
also begging for mercy. They're not going to
yeah.
get it, but they're begging for it as of today.
Yeah, so it doesn't make any sense to me, the argument that Iran's playing 4D chess and letting themselves like rope a dope. They're just sucking up the punches before going for the big counter punch. I mean, it might happen. I'm not ruling it out completely, but it does seem to me to be unlikely at this point. Particularly with the dislocation of their command and control structures that will have happened because so many of them have been killed at the top. And yes, of course, these armies do have a one man up, next man in kind of process, but that's still going to be a heavily disjointed process. And it's not going to be you can't just go one for one and expect things to carry on as they were before. So even if they're taking over, can you imagine this? You're stepping into a new military position that you probably know quite well, but you're doing it at a time when all of your peers have been killed. And on top of that, your army is getting taken apart around you by endless airstrikes that you can't do anything about. The chances of some Iranian general stepping in and suddenly gripping the battlefield, I think, is remote at this point.
Yeah. And it is interesting also, Iran has spent more money on their proxies than they have, honestly, on their own internal, military might, however, material. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what's also interesting is that the ring of fire has been extinguished. I mean, even Hezbollah has totally dissed their sugar daddy. They're like, we're out, and I think part of that is they know there's nothing they could do. But the other part is it really seems as if Lebanon is stepping closer and closer to the Abraham Accords and really finally trying to hold Hezbollah's feet to the fire, that they can no longer be a military presence in Lebanon. Agree, disagree? Your face indicates to me you disagree.
No, I think Lebanon in the Abraham Accords is a bit of a stretch right now. The country is still an absolute basket case, and Hezbollah still wields disproportionate political influence.
Do they?
Heavily weakened, but they've still got many fingers in the pies. They've got they're still elected members of Lebanon's parliament. So there's there's a long way to go for Lebanon, I would suggest. But yeah, the proxies that remain, there's still 250,000 Iranian-backed militia fighters in Iraq. The
Right.
Houthis are still going. The Houthis have just brushed off Trump's £1 billion worth uh, of airstrikes. For they endured a month of it, and it didn't really have a huge effect, quite frankly. Um, but when it comes to this, only the Houthis have actually stepped up, and they've done their traditional firing the odd cruise missile at Israel. I'd imagine the militias in Iraq and Lebanon were asked to step in, and they've gone, "What now?"
Well,
uh, yeah, don't think I will. Thank you very much. Yeah, so that's indicative of the kicking that Israel's dished out to Hezbollah, I think, over the last 20 months. And of course, Iraq is intimately connected with American forces for its security, and to escalate in Iraq would involve dragging America into the crisis. So that's the last thing they want to do. I mean, it might happen
so,
either way. And actually, I think one thing to watch, if America does weigh in
yeah.
uh, on Israel's side and start taking part in bombing raids, is what happens in Iraq. That'll be really interesting,
So,
from an objective point of view.
two questions, not peace. Two questions on Iraq, because first of all, today there was a drone strike on a U.S. Position in Iraq. It was diverted, and so my first question is: Donald Trump has said very clearly, "You touch one American, and you're toast." Not the good L'chaim kind of toast, with empty cups, but that is going to be like the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. Um, we also know that Trump is very loath to get involved in anything other than a defensive capacity. So obviously, this one drone strike or attempted drone strike on an American position in Iraq did not trigger anything. What would? Only an American death?
Well, I think a coordinated attack in a number of locations is probably the tripping point here, because if you've got one lone knobhead firing a drone, then you can kind of overlook that as a rogue actor. Whereas if it's a coordinated attack on multiple bases or multiple locations at once, that's indicative of something a bit more serious and a bit more organized. And I think that's where it becomes clear that there is another antagonist on the playing field. Um, the question would be, what does that actually look like in terms of response? Because can America afford to commit to another counterinsurgency in Iraq? I don't think so. So it's going to be airstrikes on those positions potentially, which is, and nothing is ever decided by airstrike. You need something else to happen after the airstrike to have decisive effect. Libya is a great example of what happens if you try to do just airstrikes. We decapitated the regime in Libya. Gaddafi died, and the whole place fell apart and destabilized the entire Sahel region all the way down to Mali. So it's not a good thing just to do airstrikes. So there's a really big question of what does that response actually look like and have the effect they want. Um, or does America say, right, okay, we know this isn't really uh, Iraq. this is coming from Tehran. Let's
Right.
go gangbusters. That's the other possibility. It doesn't really solve the Iraq problem, but maybe decapitating the regime in Tehran would. A mop onto Khamenei's known bunker position would be pretty decisive at this point. So there's lots of options on the table, but all of them are bad for Iran, and that's the important thing. It doesn't matter if they try and use a proxy. It doesn't matter if they try and use something domestic. I think any degree of attempted escalation is going to draw America in. And like I said, they're circling the drain, and it just what's left to work out is what the final state of play actually looks like.
So seeing that Israel has been planning this for years, or who knows, maybe decades. I mean, this has been, I feel like Netanyahu, everybody's like, oh, he just wants to save power, he just wants to save power. I feel like after this, he's going to be like, and done.
Yeah.
um, but seeing that this whole plan has been at least years in the making, do you think, because we know that Israel did not have a day after plan in Gaza, obviously, the whole world knows that now. Do you think that they went into Iran with a day after plan? Because obviously they're not going to occupy Iran. They can't just rely on the people rising up, because even if they do, there's a complete power vacuum. Somebody's need to, like, how could Israel or America even have a day after plan unless it involved occupation? How do you control any of that?
Yeah, and this is the danger with regime change. We talk about getting rid of the mullahs, and that's great. But in my Substack article the other day, I identified four options of what might happen when the regime fall, and only two of them are any good. So you've got option one, which is where kind of IRGC hardliners take over, and things are almost worse than when the mullahs are in charge. So it's a military dictatorship, and in that case, I suspect the war has to go on. Um, Option two, we're looking at um, a kind of continuity regime where somebody else just steps up and covers. Option three, we're looking at maybe a civil war almost is the next option, where actually because that opposition is so disparate and non-aligned with each other, you might get those various ethnic groupings. You get like Azeris in the north or Pashtuns in the south, or whatever it might be. They might split into their regional groups, and we get a Syria type civil war situation. So there's bad options there, and then the other two options are essentially you get a Pahlavi type figure who seizes control, and everyone comes along with him, and it becomes a golden sunlit uplands of a happier democratic Iran. That's the dream scenario, but it's very hard to see how we get there at this point. And then you've got the option where somebody takes over who was part of the old regime but takes a much more moderate line. And you still get the democratic outcome you want, but you have to make accommodations with the fact that people who aren't very nice are still in positions of power. So there's all sorts of options when it comes to regime change, but 50% of them are terrible, and are actually worse than the status quo. And so you have to try and influence it towards the positive ones. Now, how do you do that? There are groups on the ground. There are Mossad supported groups. There are American supported groups. I'm absolutely certain of it. If they can get them coordinated and working closely enough and supported by Western money and potentially arms, then that's probably how you try and steer it towards that positive end state, along with messaging. That's one thing Gaza has shown us is how important the information dimension of a war is in 2025, where everyone has a smartphone, everyone has access to the internet. That messaging campaign needs to be absolutely overwhelming. And I think taking out the TV station today was a great step towards that, as well as making for a brilliant internet funny. It's got a serious strategic implication that if you can control the messaging in Iran, then you've got a really good way of talking directly to the people and telling them what you need them to do, and where you need them to go, and how you need them to behave. So there's ways we can shape this, I think. Or I say we, there's ways that Israel and America can shape it. Um, but there's no guarantees. So it is risky. There's always
And
risks, and it's about how you mitigate those risks.
can I offer another potential outcome as far as the
Mm.
day after? Bibi has more support in Iran than he does in Israel.
You're going
So,
for Greater Israel. You're really going to
yeah,
throw
so
Greater
he
Israel in
can
there.
become the new Shah, or rabbi, whatever you would call it, of Iran, and or it becomes the 51st state of Israel, although it would only be the second state.
It'd be the
Um,
east bank.
yeah. So though obviously I'm joking. One thing I do want to point out though is that, so there are I mean, people all over Tehran who are celebrating these attacks on Iran in really aggrandizing Bibi as their savior. I mean, they're begging him to save the country. And let me point out that in the Iranian diaspora, not I don't mean the Iranian Jewish, I mean the Iranian diaspora, there are approximately 10 million Iranians outside of Iran, and we have not seen a single one of them create a protest against these attacks, which also goes to prove that these protests about Gaza were never about Israel. They are all, I mean, sorry, they were never about Gaza. They were always about destroying Israel. They were always about destroying whatever, the Jewish people. The Iranians are begging for this, and we've seen elements of this in Gaza as well. But because Gaza is so small, I think it's very hard for anyone to speak against Hamas undetected. They will all be beheaded. But in Iran, I mean, it's a much larger country, and also many in the diaspora that people can feel a little bit more free when the regime is this unstable to speak against the regime. But it does seem that most of the Iranian people understand that there may be a high price to pay, just like they understand in Israel, but this is going to be the key to their liberation, and they get
Yeah, and I suppose the counterpoint to that would be that this has been a very precise operation. Civilian collateral damage is very low. We're only 3 days into it. There is a very decisive victory almost immediately. So there's a lot of factors that kind of aren't there when it comes to the Gaza war. I have seen some Iranian diaspora online being quite grumpy about this.
that.
It's not universally popular.
Yeah.
Um, and I think if it escalates in any way that civilian areas do start taking a pounding, then I think we might see a change. Um, but to speak to your broader point, the fact that there were contemptible wretches in London waving Iranian flags at the protest yesterday, it's almost worse than the stupid Hamas flags they've been waving. It is genuinely mind blowing that a country that evil can get people's popular support for the simple reason that they're fighting Israel. I mean, it's
Yes.
sickening. It's sickening, quite frankly. And those people are. I hope they're all on. I hope they're all on some kind of watch list now, because it just shows the unbelievably stupid ignorance of these people. They obviously don't understand what they're cheering for, um,
Exactly.
and it blows my mind. It really does. Yeah.
But that's my point exactly. But they're not cheering for anything. They're cheering against the Jews. What kills me is, as Netanyahu said, I understand America, fill in the country. I understand America first. What I don't understand is America dead. Like, do these people not realize that this ICBM production is meant to destroy the Western world, and Israel is just the first step in the conquest? Like, they are
No, they
literally
don't.
hearing.
They
Do they
don't.
really not get that?
No, of course they don't. Of course they don't. They don't realize that Iran is an apocalyptic death cult that is responsible for huge amounts of narco terrorism around the world through Hezbollah in South America. It's responsible for people smuggling, for drug smuggling, for weapons smuggling into Europe. We've done a really poor job, I think, of telling the world how dreadful Iran really is. Because we live in a moment where people live from dopamine hit to dopamine hit. This isn't the 1960s and 70s where people actually kind of understood that when planes were getting hijacked, there was a really bad malign actor behind it. The enemy has developed its tactics very cleverly. I mean, hell, there's people in the US who are obviously in receipt of money to push the "don't go to war with Iran" line. And unfortunately, a lot of the people opposing this war, particularly on the kind of woke right, as I believe the new phrase for it is, a lot of those people are very influenced by these influencers. These people genuinely have voices that other people listen to, and so when uh, Tucker or Candace or whoever it might be say, "Don't go to war with Iran because Iran's not that bad," people believe them because they don't know any better because they've never taken the time to learn or never had the opportunity to learn what this stuff actually means. And like I said, if it's social media dopamine, living in the moment, immediate gratification, you can see how that situation arises. But it is founded ultimately on ignorance, which is a real shame.
How did you read or feel about Pierce Morgan going, okay, now I get it. I actually support their right to go into Iran now. Do they and does he not realize that the war in Gaza is the war in Iran? Like, is there that much of a disconnect?
Look, I think these people just say what will get them the most clicks. Look, they get paid by click, and it's therefore very much to their incentive to say whatever's going to get them the most clicks at any given moment in time. And clearly, the swell of popular discourse is in favour of Israel on this one. And he's worked out that that's the market he needs to tap up today. Tomorrow, when it goes back to the Gaza war, when this is all over, which I suspect once Iran fall will be over exceptionally quickly. Um, yeah, he'll
Even
be
given
he'll
the
be he'll be, he'll
hostages?
be look, the hostages are not coming back through military action. I've had this debate online so many times. It's like if you could have freed them with military force in 20 months, they would have been freed. That's not an option on the table. So we need to look at other ways of leveraging pressure on Hamas to get them to give up the hostages. And to me, that looks like ceasing military operations, declaring unilateral victory, holding what you've got, and then continuing to squeeze Hamas through control of aid and through empowering Hamas's rivals on the ground in Gaza, like the rival clans that we've started to see happening. Um, that's how you get the hostages back. You don't do it by endlessly airstriking low-level to mid-level goons and causing enormous strategic damage to your reputation on the international stage as you do so.
You don't think that Qatar is going to step in when Iran falls and or Turkey to rebuild the Ring of Fire and take them back to their original glory?
Well, I've said for a long time that the the Shia Ring of Fire is going to be replaced by the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood. That was, Ring of Fire. That was my first take when it came to when it came to Assad falling. It was like this is a
Hmm.
golden opportunity for Qatar and Turkey. But we have a handbrake on Turkey because their economy is so intertwined with the EU's. Um, we have a way of leveraging economic pressure on Turkey should they step too far out. So that's partially in hand. Qatar are far more subtle than Iran. They want to play both sides. So they will throw money at the problem and empower the groups they like and disempower the groups they don't like. And it'll be a much slower, longer burning thing. And it's going to be so long and slow burning that there is time then for people opposed to that concept to actually step in and do something about it. And actually, I think in hindsight, now Iran is in real trouble. I couldn't work out why Israel and America were treating al-Sharaa in Syria the way they were. I thought it was far too soon. I thought it didn't make any sense given that he is a psychopath ISIS Al Qaeda member. It makes no sense. But now, of course, the fact that we know that Israeli jets were launched from Syrian air bases
Exactly.
and Iraqi air bases to do the first wave in Iran, that then becomes clear. So that's the bigger strategy here. Bibi has played a blinder on his long strategy for Iran, as long as we get the result that we're looking for.
And do you think that he was waiting for Syria to fall, or was that a lucky domino that to
No,
dictate
I think that
that?
was a lucky domino, I think. But
Okay.
the actions with the new HTS regime subsequently make a lot more sense now in hindsight.
Did you hear this report that that the German Air Force was accidentally turned on their receiver for a minute and were found to be aiding and abetting? It's interesting because I really do think that Mers, Starmer, Macron, I think that there's in many ways slaves to their jihadi bases more than they are ideologically necessarily opposed. When I say jihadi, I don't equate that with Muslim. I equate it with the any color, any race, any creed. I don't even know what a creed is. Who are calling for the destruction of Israel? I'm talking about all of them. I'm not talking about Muslims. I'm talking about all the people who are marching in the streets and taking over, the bridges and in causing mayhem.
Yeah, I mean, I'd call them just pro-Hamas lunatics, or just let's call them fifth columnists and useful idiots. Let's go back to the Cold War terminology. I think that's really appropriate here. There are fifth columnists, the people leading the marches, and the people that they have conned into following them are useful idiots. Who, frankly, half of them will be first against the wall if they ever get what they want.
Okay, so again, so Starmer, Murs, and Macron all called Bibi after the strike. I know that they said they want de-escalation, but they all called to say, but we support this, at least in theory. So again, I'm questioning what their true ideological intentions are, less so Macron. I think Macron truly is anti-Israel, but that just like Trump or even Biden, there's a lot of this like good cop, bad cop to appease your base, but also do what needs to be done to save Western civilization.
Yeah, I mean, look, the G7, I think today voted in favour of Israel's right to self-defense, so that's a very clear message. The UK are pushing HMS, I think it's Prince of Wales, the aircraft carrier, towards the Gulf, ready to kind of help stabilise anything that might escalate. Um, so in practical terms, we're not doing too badly. Um, I think people realise that this is a fait accompli, like it's happening whether you back it or not. So you might as well keep the White House on side and make the right moves to show support for it, because it's going to happen whether you do it or not. So why pointlessly die in a ditch when you know you're going to alienate the world's only military superpower? So it makes perfect sense. And of course, the speeches they put out about de-escalation were very, very milquetoast. They were
Yes.
very vanilla, and that's deliberately so they can say to their electoral base that they're scared of, look, we didn't support Israel, but by the same token, actions and words haven't quite aligned. So we're doing a bit of a Qatar, actually. We're kind of
Yeah.
playing both sides at this point.
And also, as we've said many times, I'm the biased one in this bar, and you are very objective about things. So from my read, okay, because I feel personally attacked, not by you, personally attacked by Iran. It feels like the leaders of the G7 are saying exactly what Trump said to Houthi, which is, okay, well, as long as you only hit Israel, it's okay. But you dare to touch us, and we're going to step in, and that means business. And it makes me really sad that Israel is doing the offensive, dirty work for everybody. And it's not. I do know that there have been significant defensive assistance from the G7, and even from even Syria letting us use their airspace, even Jordan apparently still shooting down some missiles. Um, but it just sort of feels like Israel will forever be the whipping boy of the West, and never appreciated for the work that they are doing for the rest of society,
Yeah, I mean,
civilization.
I think that feels a bit PR to me. I don't think Israel's doing it. They haven't sat there in Jerusalem and gone, "We need to save the West. Let's get this done." They're doing it for Israel. The
They're
happy, the
doing it
happy,
for Israel, but it's
the
still
happy,
saving the
the
West.
happy, the happy side effect is that the rest of the world benefits from it. But
Right.
let's not pretend that Israel has launched this campaign from some sort of selfless commitment to world peace.
Sure.
They've done it because Iran is existentially threatening their country. Um, and actually, from a kind of British perspective, then why should we join in? Israel are doing this for themselves. Yes, we benefit, but why would we put our servicemen and women in harm's way for Israel's sake? I mean, especially when Israel is more than capable of doing it alone, and
Yeah.
has. I don't think they've taken one single military loss over Iran in every sortie they've flown.
Well,
I think
what is Britain still like committed to an arms embargo, for example?
to an arms
Arms
embargo for who?
embargo on Israel. I mean, how as they've
We haven't
threatened,
got we
like,
haven't got an arms embargo. I think we've
yeah,
stopped like a tiny percentage of our contracts. And again, that was performative, so they could say
yeah,
to that voter base, "Oh, look, we've done something." In terms of practical effects on the war, the practical effects are absolutely zero.
okay,
It's made no difference whatsoever to the
oh,
prosecution of any front in the war. So it's all fairly tokenistic stuff to play to the home base. So yeah, they're balancing that domestic consideration against the international consideration.
Okay. Well, I mean, I know that you wanted to go for a half hour, and I always want to go for like 30 hours instead of 30 minutes. We're at
That's your yogi.
45.
That's your yogi stamina coming into it.
That's right. The old yogi stamina. I think for your sake, I know it's late there, but it's the middle of the day here. Do you have any closing thoughts or remarks that you'd like to leave us with?
No, no, I think that's I think we've covered it all. I think the key headline point for me has been the information battle that's been going on around this war, where people are trying to persuade, portray it as if Iran has somehow been in the fight, as opposed to utterly punch drunk from the first minute and barely able to land a blow. And it's really important to just emphasize this is a massive win for Israel. And what they have to do now is work out how to seize the end game that they want. And that's the real challenge in a war. And we've seen it in Gaza. They won ages ago. They haven't been able to seize a suitable conclusion. In Iran, they can't afford to make that mistake. And let's hope that it's the right conclusion for the region.
Yeah. Amen. And the only commentary that I really want to leave everybody with right now is Am Yisrael Chai. We live, we survive. It's what we do. We have no choice. So, do you understand those Hebrew words?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've heard it once or twice.
Yeah, once or twice in a back alley somewhere in Tel Aviv.
But yeah, if you enjoyed that, please do like, subscribe, and feel free to make a comment. We always love to hear what people think. We'll get this posted in a sort of recorded version tomorrow. So if you're watching it 24 hours after the fact, please do the same. We'd be grateful to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an episode. And please leave your comments, keep them respectful. And we love hearing your thoughts and adding in our own. Even though Andrew very charitably said we covered it all, there's no way to cover it all. So go ahead and leave your questions below.
Fantastic. Well, until next time, cheers for that.
L'chaim. We'll see you next week. And
And now
I
Shana has to work out how to end the thing.